Thanks so much for being here. Welcome to the Department of Communication annual lecture. Just do a little tech check-in with the Zoom people. I hope all is going well. Let us know if there are any adjustments that we have to make. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Erica Shar, the chair of the Department of Communication at UMass Amherst. And I would like to begin with an acknowledgement that we're gathering on the unceded homelands of the Pecumtuck Nation on the land of the Norwottuck community. And I'd also like to acknowledge Earth Day today amid the many threats to the health of our planet. Welcome to both our in-person audience members and those tuning in on Zoom. For folks in the latter group, just a couple of logistics. The session will be recorded today, so by joining the Zoom, you're indicating your consent to be part of that recorded session. Your camera and mic will be disabled, but there'll be a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and Professor Seth Goldman will communicate your questions to the in-person group so that you can hear them and the answers as well. Thank you to Seth for that. So the annual lecture is in its infancy under its current name, with this year's event just the third such event. However, the tradition from which this series stems is far from new. We have posted a long list of scholars, performers, makers, and activists in the past who have helped us maintain our department's position as a vibrant space for thinking and acting amid the challenges and the possibilities of the world around us. This particular forum provides a space for the exchange of ideas and perspectives that highlight the contributions of communication to the critical understanding of contemporary social problems. This lecture creates a formal occasion for us to recognize and invite a speaker each spring, and it follows from our departmental history of advancing critical, rigorous, and engaged communication scholarship and practice. The annual lecture is funded by the department's alumni and donors, and I would especially like to thank Michelle Cardinal and the Cardinal O'Leary Fund that supports visiting speakers and research activities expressly related to progressive communication ideas. The annual lecture is administered by the department's Research and Intellectual Life Committee, we call it RAIL, and that includes Professors Wayne Hsu, Gonen Dori-Hacohen, and Martha Fuentes Batista, and PhD student Oliver Padilla. Many thanks to those folks for organizing this event, and especially a heartfelt thank you to Martha Fuentes for her leadership. To Anna Jabber, who was instrumental in promoting this lecture, Donna Berg and Amanda Kimball for their help with logistics, and Sarah DePaula and Sam Safardi Jackson from the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, who have lent a very helpful hand behind the scenes. And I'd also like to thank our Dean Carl Rethemeyer, for his support for scholarly engagement in the social and behavioral sciences and his presence today. It is my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished featured speaker for the 2022 Department of Communication Annual Lecture, Dr. Charlton McIlwain, who will deliver the talk, How to Make Technology Anti-Racist. Dr. McIlwain is Professor of Media, Culture, and Communication and Vice Provost for Faculty Engagement and Development at NYU, New York University. His work focuses on the intersections of race, digital media, and social and racial justice activism. He is the founder of the Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies, a network of prominent public scholars of color who research, share knowledge, and convene stakeholders at the intersections of race and technology to address social discrimination, especially that enacted through the design, deployment, and use of digital technology applications and platforms. Dr. McIlwain is the author or co-author of multiple books, including Black Software, the Internet and Racial Justice, From the Afronet to Black Lives Matter, and Race Appeal, How Candidates Invoke Race in U.S. Political Campaigns, and co-editor of the Routledge Companion to Race and Ethnicity. He has authored or co-authored multiple scholarly articles with recent titles including Beyond the Hashtags, #Ferguson, #Black Lives Matter, and the Online Struggle for Offline Justice, Quantifying the Power and Consequences of Social Media Protest, and Racial Formation, Inequality, and the Political Economy of Web Traffic, just to name a few. He is also one of the authors of the influential study #Communication So White, which shows racial inequalities and biases in citation patterns in communication journals. with research expertise that spans political communication, media depictions of death and dying, digital media platforms and political economy, and racial justice activism. His work is central to a great deal of the people and the projects here in the Department of Communication at UMass. We are thrilled to have him, grateful for his presence here in the Communication Hub, and delighted to welcome Dr. Charlton McIlwain.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that introduction. I'm always taken by introductions that really go far back and pick up on work that I think many people don't know, including work that I did early in my career, which is around death and dying, which was a subject of my dissertation work, and then following, and then work that I really tried to run away from very quickly. But it's interesting that every several months or so, I get calls by somebody about that, and I have to tell them, I don't want to talk about that because it will drive me to drink more. But thank you, and thanks to all of you being here. This is amazing. It's great to be in this physical space with you. I don't want to discount the Zoom audience. It's good to be with you, but for once, it's good to be able to say I'm looking at people and not seeing other people that you don't get to see when you're in our cubicles and offices and so forth, staring basically at a screen or 2 or 3 people to give a talk with no feedback and no audience and no engagement of the kind that we're often used to. So this is a great moment to reunite and figure out if we can still do this kind of thing. And lots of thanks to all the people and teams that it took to get me here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the presumption early on in the spring that this would happen and that we would make it happen, and was immediately happy to sign on to come, and particularly to do this in-person event. So thanks to all of you. I want to start, as I often do, with a few caveats. The first is that I had a wonderful experience earlier of hanging out with many of the graduate students from the department. Ultimately, we got into the subject of the talk, so I gave them carte blanche permission to walk out anytime that they would like to. They've heard it all. They've gotten the punchline. They know the drill, so if you see them walking out, that's why. And so, but it was great to be with them and to sort of do a little warm up for the talk, because they zeroed in on essentially what I think is important to be sharing about today in the context of thinking about racial justice in the context of technology. The other caveat I will make is, I feel increasingly the pressure, and I can't remember who it was that was mentioned that did a lot of the promotion, but the promotion was so good that my anxiety level about expectations increased over the last week or so, and having those thoughts of inadequacy and thinking, I really have nothing profound to say here today. So that's the other caveat. Expect nothing profound, but I do, and my expectation is to help share a little bit of a story and to kind of reorient our thinking and focus as we think about a question that I think is increasingly part of certainly academic conversations, but public conversations beyond academia, beyond our higher education institutions, our research institutions, and so forth. And so what I really aim to do today is really to walk you through a little bit of my thinking and work over the last few years and the ways that I have been trying to think through some of these questions. The last caveat I have is about what you're seeing on the screen. I hope you've been sufficiently mesmerized. That was the point of the flashing lights. I hope I haven't caused you any headaches or things of that nature. But I spent an inordinate amount of time on the train yesterday coming up, trying to make this work, trying to deal with multiple platforms from Adobe Spark to Google Slides here and a number of others. And nothing seemed to work. And finally, I got it to work. And then I got to thank our communications team here today that dealt with some even more complications as I asked to try to make this work here with this connection. So thanks for indulging me. And I often get fixated on small things like this that are really inconsequential, but it's there. And it's there for this reason, to kind of introduce and give you a little context about the talk today, how to make technology anti-racist. And in many respects, this is the way that I experience this question and this engagement over the last 2 or 3 years as a kind of set of flashing lights and signals along the side of the road, flashing how to make your technology anti-racist, right? Which exhibits a desire, which I think is a positive one, amongst scholars, amongst technologists, amongst policymakers alike, about thinking about how we make technologies increasingly less racist, less biased, less discriminatory. And nevertheless, they come across in this kind of way, in this sort of flashy manner, as if to say, we can do this. There is a fix. I've got the answer. Here's how you do it. There's 3 or 4 step process. Go through that, and magically this will appear, and we will solve this problem. And for many of us, including I think many of you in this room, we know that the answer is much more complex. And yet when I speak with many audiences, particularly those who are computer scientists or engineers, folks working in data science and so forth, this comes across in this way, as a reality, as a quick way to say, look, I understand that technology breeds and produces discrimination and bias and all of these things. So what do we do about it? How do I fix it? Where's the code? What's the platform? How do I make this do something differently? As if to say, all I need is the tools, the direction. I can sit down at my keyboard and make this happen. And so I want to start off with the way I often do, which is with the punchline, right? How to make our technology anti-racist, which is to say, can we? Maybe. In some ways, at least in our current situation and structures, I might lean to say, probably not. But mostly I want to say that this is perhaps not the question that we need to ask. Or certainly we don't need to fixate on the objects that this question, so put and so articulated, focuses on. And so as I begin, I want to make this sort of assertion and statement. And again, this is for all of you folks that are here, folks that are online. I frequently have gotten in the habit of liking to do this because it gives folks a sense that they've gotten something if they walked into the room, and gives them an excuse to walk out of the room at any time, and nothing lost and so forth. And that's to deliver the punchline, right? If I'm a comedian, punchline before all the setup. So I'm going to give you the punchline first, do the setup, and then we'll come back to the punchline again, perhaps in a little bit different ways, and then really looking forward to the engagement both with you and our folks that are joining us online. And so the answer is simply this, that making technology anti-racist means shifting our perspective and our primary focus away from technologies themselves, the data, the software applications, the platforms, the code, the modeling, the bias, and focus our attention on technological infrastructures. That is the social, the cultural, the intensely political aspects of technology that really drive the types of discriminatory effects, the biases, the supports for racism and so forth that are embedded with and are a byproduct of our technological systems. And so again, this is really about shifting focus. And I was thinking back to a few days ago, I did I looked at, try to advance this slide, which is not working with my arrow keys. Someone told me there was another way to advance. I could touch the screen. Is that maybe, or no? Yeah, thank you. Okay, perfect. Yep. So I read, one of the reviews of my book, Black Software, which I like to do. I like to read most reviews. I don't like to read comments, of course, on platforms. Never do that. But I love reading thoughtful reviews of the book because they highlight for me the way that audiences think about them, what they digested, what they focused on, what they thought was critical about the arguments made and so forth. And so I found a new review, or at least a review that was new to me. And part of what the author said, the review was very positive, which I'm always grateful for. But one of the shortcomings she said was that there was sort of a little bit of a bait and switch, right? There was a talk about Black software. And so if you're a technologist, you're a computer scientist, you're an engineer, was expecting to go in and see some detail about software development or software, hardware, technology architecture, or all of these technical types of things. And so she says, for the person coming to look for that, there was sort of a quick move past what we think of as software and software development to something that was much more intensely social, political, cultural. And I thought, awesome, you got it. That was precisely the point, and hopefully the folks that were coming to get what they thought they were getting got something also that I thought that they needed, which was the point of the book, and also one of the ways that I experienced writing Black software. And so to give a little bit of a context in what ultimately became this book, which began very differently. Several years ago, thinking about the impact that Black Lives Matter and related movements were having on the fabric of US politics and social and technological life, both here in the States and beyond, and trying to understand the ways in which technology helped to stimulate or produce some of those impacts that I think were highly impactful, influential. And so I set out simply to try to account for and understand what had changed in our media environment to make something like a Black Lives Matter possible. And I started this question thinking, this is an easy book. It's time bound, a very short history that begins mostly in the present and extends back maybe as far as the early mid 1990s when the internet as we know it comes online. So that was my sort of long starting point intentionally. And the more I began researching the book, and really the more I began talking to people from our current time, but then back into the early 2000s, into the 1990s, particularly groups of African-American developers, designers, hobbyists, et cetera, that were pioneers in bringing us the internet as we know it, I began to see something else take shape, right? And this happened for me with, in part, with a question that I asked everyone as I started many of my interviews with folks. And that was with a question that I thought I knew the answer to, that was not a difficult one. And it was simply, when did you first get online? Right? So I wanted a little bit of the story of that moment when these folks began their interactions with technology. And again, I thought I knew the answer, right? It might be a few years from now, the longest it's going to be maybe 1990, 91, 92, until I met William Morrell. William Morrell lives not too far from here in Roxbury section of Boston. And at the time that I met him, what I knew about him came from a website. That website has the names that you see on this book here, Black Software. Is the first time I had seen those two words together, and I wanted to understand what he meant by it. It wasn't easily understood when I looked at his website, which looked like it hadn't changed since about 1994 in terms of style and so forth. But I couldn't understand what it was he meant by the concept of Black software. So I was eager to interact and engage with him and understand. So I asked William that question. William, when did you first get online? And to my surprise, William hesitated, and I started like, and all the while I'm thinking, this is not a hard question, right? There's a time, I think we all know it. But eventually William answered and said, about 1978. And that was the first moment for me of thinking, what does that mean? What does it mean that you were online in a sense that we share and know perfectly well what we're talking about in 1978? What did that look like? There was no internet in the way that we know the internet today. So what do you mean by that? And so he started that story, and I won't go into depth into the rest of that conversation, but it was the first moment for me of realizing there was something more, there was something bigger, there was something beyond Black Lives Matter in our present moment in terms of this connection to and engagement with technology. And that was the first diversion off my pathway into a longer historical pathway that ultimately led back to the early 1960s and a broader question that ultimately emerged that became the backdrop for the book, which was really about what has been and what is Black people's relationship to computing technology. And that, as a much more broader question, ultimately was the road leading to my ultimate goals, which was to understand the dynamics of power and privilege in the exercise and the building of technology that could account for the multiple ways in which discrimination happens in and through our technological systems. And so this forms the backdrop and the context for much of what we will talk about today. It's just hitting me that I failed to answer or ask one critical question, and that's when I should stop talking. As you can kind of tell, I could go on and on and on. So maybe I'll just put it this way. If someone will give me about 5 minutes of flagging of when I should actually just stop, that would be great. And I will wrap up and really want to leave a lot of time for the Q&A and so forth. But I'm very good in sort of going right from wherever that point is to the end point and transitioning. So if someone will just yell out or whatever works. So here's how I want to proceed for the next few minutes. I want to start off with a few assertions, arguments that really help to frame my particular view on the subject matter and the question of the talk today. And from there, I want to talk about infrastructure as a way of, and as I have asserted, should be the focus of our attention when we're trying to really address this question about what do we do about this engagement with race and technology, particularly in the interest of transforming technological impacts on things like racial discrimination, racial justice, and so forth. And so I want to walk through what I call 7 components of technological infrastructures. From there, I want to walk you through essentially an example, a historical story about how that infrastructure was first built and draw a particular set of lessons perhaps or observations from it. And then I want to finally end with some 3 not sort of magic bullets of what we must do to make our technology anti-racist, but the ways that we must adjust our thinking about the question of race, technology, and the broad area of discrimination, justice, etc. So here's the first assertion. Modern computing technology was developed to support, strengthen, and sustain the racial order that we call white supremacy. And I phrase this in a very deliberate way in terms of the use of passive voice here. For all you graduate students in here, my graduate students know the one thing I always talk about is when you write in active voice. Passive voice is strategic, used often to conceal something or to perform something else very deliberately. But as a rule, active voice is great. This particular assertion is phrased in passive voice intentionally to talk about and to highlight the kind of tension that exists with this question between the intentionality of that active voice and the implicitness of passive voice in the question of technology and technological discrimination. That is, the degree to which technological discrimination happens and begins as an intentional act, and the ways in which it happens as a byproduct of unintentional actions, and the way that that tension has been created and what the implications of that tension are. The other thing embedded in this statement here is about the ordering, and to call attention to the fact that, of course, racism and white supremacy precede modern computing, right? And so part of the effort here in refocusing attention is about refocusing our attention on what matters. Often that attention is about the technology, right? The technical systems. When those things appeared in a context that already pre-existed and therefore shapes that technology itself. And so one of the interventions is to help to highlight and demonstrate the ways in which the structures and systems of white supremacy exist and therefore work to shape things that come alongside it, including our modern computing technology. Second, and this is mostly a way to rephrase the first assertion, modern computing technology is the infrastructure on which racism, a system of institutions that automate the distribution of advantage and disadvantage, privilege and power along racial lines flourishes, right? So alongside this continuum in which racism, white supremacy are already well embedded in our social systems, and then the rise of modern computing, that modern computing then gets developed to help to sustain the status quo, that is the status quo of racism and white supremacy. And so that is, in essence, the contention in how I see the primary relationship between these two factors, racism and technology, that ultimately have a bearing on how we might think about disrupting, even transforming these type of systems. All right, everybody with me thus far? Good, okay. So I'm gonna have to start getting a new example. If there's anyone even here or maybe even online that have heard a talk that I've given over the last couple of years, you've seen this example, but it's just so good in sort of illustrating one key point. But there are many stories like this. But this one comes from 2018. It comes from The Intercept, a investigative journalism outlet that many of you are probably well familiar with. And this story dropped as a result of a long investigation. And it dropped making sort of 2 points. Number one, the kind of headline here, IBM used NYPD surveillance footage to develop technology that lets police search by skin color. So the first bombshell was simply, this is happening, right? That someone is building a system intentionally designed to ameliorate a problem that is fundamentally a racial problem, the solution fundamentally racial, and giving us the tools and ability to cast a wide net and use skin color as a filter for thinking about criminality and for identifying and targeting criminal suspects. The second point and bombshell of the story was something embedded down several paragraphs, which was that the NYPD and IBM were colluding on this project in secret for some 5 years. And when I first read this in 2018, book was already written, mostly done and in the can. And rather than the shock and surprise, the story induced, particularly at this point, a little bit of laughter, right? And it induced that laughter for me because I thought, you all missed the boat clearly, that this is not a 5-year story. It's a 50-year one, more than 50-year one. Not just in terms of the general connection between technology, race, and policing, but specific connections between IBM, the NYPD, and varying projects that look and sound a lot like this. And so my point, the reason that I raise it is because, again, we often think about this connection around race and technology, and particularly about what to do about it from a very presentist lens. Wow, this is just happening. Wow, we've never seen anything like this. Wow, what do we do? This seems so revolutionary, when in fact it is very not new. It is very not old. And one can trace the development of it in a way that seems peculiarly mundane, right? To see a project that begins 50 years earlier and simply coming to full fruition in many ways in the last few years in particular evolutions of technology like this. And so to emphasize the necessity for thinking about history and the necessity of thinking about what historical affordances we have to understand really what the problem is when it comes to this intersection of race and technology, or when it comes to thinking about the question of what we do. How do we change or transform the future? Can our future be anything different in which technology does something more than discriminate or ensure the social order, the racial order of white supremacy remains intact, working for those it has always worked for and served? So I want to quickly move to thinking about some of this history. And when we look at a longer history, and of course, the history I'm talking about is about 50 plus years old, beginning around 1960 and moving up to the present. But the history is older than that. But this is a particular starting place that I had because it charts the pathway of two intersections. Number one, the modern rise of computing development that really starts to hit its zenith in the late 1950s and early 60s, and the simultaneous rise and zenith in some respects of the civil rights movement, which happens at the same time. And when we think about history, we think about the connection of these two things, we don't typically have a history for seeing those two moments as something that intersects and are intertwined. I'm thinking back to Terry McPherson's work several years ago in an edited book called Race After Technology by Lisa Nakamura, in which she begins down this road and saying, there is something about this parallel moment in the 1960s when we're talking about computing and computing infrastructure, and particularly operating systems at that moment in the early 1960s about Unix and Multics and which systems are better, et cetera. And then this moment of civil rights. And she casts these as two moments that are taking place in parallel, but that are vastly divorced from each other, meaning the folks that are embroiled in these conversations around software and operating systems are not the people that are embroiled in the story around civil rights and vice versa. And part of the realization of writing and researching Black software was to see that that was entirely not the case, to see that these two things, that is the rise of modern computing and the zenith of the civil rights struggle, were intimately intertwined and defined each other in many ways, much of which, or part of which, we'll talk about here. But it's looking at that history, and that history intertwined over the last 50 plus years, where it becomes clear in many respects how we got to where we are today, right? When we think about how could that system, facial recognition system by IBM and the NYPD, be something that we want to build, are capable of building, are capable of scaling today. When people look at that and go, wow, where did that wow really come from? And there is a pathway in which we can see that playing out, which also my argument is that if that pathway is revealed, if that infrastructure is revealed, that at least in part gives us a way of thinking about where and how transformation happens. And that is happening at the level of and in connection with infrastructure. And so these 7 dimensions of techno-racial infrastructure, as I mentioned them, beginning with the problem, that is the way in which we both as a society think about and conjure and frame what problems matter and what matter most. And again, these are social and intensely political dimensions. And so what is the problem? What societally wide do we think of collectively as our most important collective problem as a society or as a collection of different societies? And so computing, technology, and infrastructures begin there. What is that problem that must be solved? The second being institutionalization, that is the moment in which this problem is taken up by one or more institutions. That is when different institutions co-sign, if you will, and saying this is a problem that we must deal with institutionally and bring the institution to bear in terms of addressing or solving it. Translation, this is the translation in particular of both the problem and the institutionalization of that problem into a computational form. And so what does that look like when we think of, all right, a problem that computing technology can help us to solve, and how do we translate that problem into computing language? After that application, that is the translation happens, we've got the translation from problem to institution, both of those folded into translation into computational language, an application that then gets built from that, an application meant and designed to address and solve that particular problem in and through and defined by those institutions. And then that application gets scaled, meaning it's reproduced, it's distributed widely, it's built upon, and then after that, varying forms of reapplication, or what we might call even evolution. And so that application gets reused and reused in search of solving the same problem, evolves to help address new forms or dynamic aspects of that problem, and then ultimately ubiquity, a sense in which that technology, that application, the series of applications becomes simply the backdrop, the infrastructure, what powers all of our technologies. And the point then about technological infrastructures, those that are discriminatory in some ways, is that all of those are fundamentally part of that infrastructure, right? And so going back to that sense of intention or passive intention, if we might call it that, or the implicitness. And so part of the thing that tracks over this historical period of time is a moment of intentionality where there is a concentration on a very real problem with very intentional solutions and means for addressing those problems. And then a point in time after which all of those things are embedded in an infrastructure at a moment when no one then questions the applications, the ways that they have been deployed, or the outcomes that come from it or that are derived from it. And so that sense of ubiquity. All right, so these are the 7 sort of phases that are not meant to be sort of a step-by-step necessarily. They happen obviously dynamically. They happen over a period of time. Many of these things are happening concurrently in the process of building these infrastructures, but it gives us an analytic way to think then through how does this actually happen, or how did it happen? And then provides a backdrop for us to think about where might we intervene if intervention, or at least impactful intervention, requires intervening here at the level of infrastructure, as opposed to primarily intervention at the level of, let's say, application or a technical product. So let's talk about the problem. Again, this is an example that really comes through in much more detail in the book, but I think it is helpful to sort of walk through to see these moments. And in part of the putting these things together in the course of writing the book, what was revolutionary, at least to me and in my mind, which had never put together these 2 aspects, that is technology and race and civil rights and so forth, was the way in which this was all fairly clear, right? We live in a day now where, of course, everybody obfuscates anything that might ultimately belie some type of bias or discrimination and so forth, right? We make sure our code and our systems and all those things are impenetrable. We don't keep the knowledge distributable out to the public. We hide who made what and who contributed to funding what and the building of all of this infrastructure. But there was a moment in time where none of that was really part of our discourse around technology development. It was simply laid bare that we have problems that need solutions, where we can find useful tools. And so this is how we're going to use those tools. And that's the story I want to quickly sort of walk us through on the way to thinking again about and addressing this question: how do we intervene? How do we transform? How do we think about different futures in terms of the ways that technology engages with and in some ways structures social life in a way that is more equitable? So beginning with the problem, it was interesting to me to see Tom Watson Jr., who in the late 1950s, early 1960s, takes over the helm as president of IBM from his father, who founded the company before him, frames not only computing, but frames IBM's mission as a company as a problem-solving mission. The company's mission is to solve problems as they may exist everywhere in the world and in every context. And this was truly IBM's way of thinking about its business enterprise. Another caveat of the book that's all the way through there, that's an interesting story in and of itself, is sort of a kind of a shadow history of IBM and the way that it works. And we typically think about IBM as a technology company and one of the founding and primary technology companies at the dawn of modern computing development. But in many respects, IBM was equally as much a marketing company as it was a technology company. And they approached technological development from a marketing standpoint. And I'll give you an example. What they would do was not sort of the way we sort of think about product development today, which is We do a little testing. We kind of understand a little bit about what problems we may want to solve, et cetera, et cetera. We build an application, then we market it out to people and companies and organizations that we think might make use of it, right? What IBM would do would be to start from the beginning with a salesman walk in the door of, say, the head of the FBI, and simply having a conversation about, what do you need? What problems are you facing today in the criminal justice arena? Here are some of the things that we've been toying with over at IBM and in the lab, and building a capability of this kind or that kind. But we're really just talking and thinking and building a few things in that way. And we really want to know simply, what is your problem? And they would focus in on this person, head of FBI being one example here, of saying, here's the problem of criminal justice as we see it. Here's the problem of policing as we see it. Here are the key priorities that we need to really try to focus on. And then the rest of the time and IBM's effort would be to providing and building and designing something that would speak directly to that particular problem, and then replicating that in policing and criminal justice, in transportation and in banking and every other form of sector of the industry, building these types of applications. But it began with, tell me what the problem is in great levels of detail, and then we formulate and design the technology accordingly. And so this begins as a way of thinking about technology and computing in particular as a problem-solving tool, and a way of thinking about technology design that gets then replicated over and over. Watson's first sort of thought about problems and problems connected to technology at a societal level comes head to head for the first time, or at least in one first instance, at this moment in 1965, which was the famous Watts Uprising at the time. And this particular image here, which is simply a collection of frames from a documentary film, Watts Riot or Revolt. For anybody interested in this area, it is worth watching. It is fascinating. You can find it on YouTube. But for the first time, this caught my attention, not so much because of its coverage of the uprisings themselves, which I had seen many examples of, but it was because of what cropped up about 3 minutes into the documentary, which was this frame about IBM that revealed that IBM had indeed commissioned this documentary. And I won't go to the ins and outs of the documentary, but itself was significantly important alongside a set of official government reports about the aftermath, explaining or trying to explain the Watts uprisings, that then ends up influencing the trajectory of the things that were marshaled to help solve this kind of problem. But this was the moment that those two things come head to head. And the moment also is very specific to this next phase, right? So if we go back and think about what this problem is and how it is framed in this particular context, one could probably easily venture a reading, right? The problem is crime, lawlessness, Black people, urban environments, all of those things that are crystallized in these images here that were exploding on the streets of Watts, but of course on streets across large cities and even smaller towns across the United States throughout the 1960s, particularly around the mid-60s era now. And so this all goes into the shaping, the framing, contextualization of what the United States begins to see as its fundamental societal problem, and that is a problem of Blackness primarily, that is masked as a problem of crime and lawlessness. So we move to this next phase of institutionalization, that is the ways that institutions then began to take up not only this particular problem, but this particular framing of the problem of crime, of lawlessness, etc. And that begins with a set of executive orders and organizations that were put in place by then President Lyndon Johnson. And so we have an interesting sort of trajectory here that in July of 1965, Lyndon Johnson, in part pushed by members of his own party, primarily white Southerners, that crime is rampant, that it is the preeminent problem of the United States that must be met with some type of government solution. Interestingly, Johnson didn't really agree with most of his supporters who thought that, but the push was heavy, so the political imperative was there, and he relented and called into being this commission, the Commission on Law Enforcement and the Administration of Justice. July 1965, August 1965, Watts happens. After Watts, there is an investigation in California through multiple agencies, as well as connection to some federal agencies to try to understand what happened in Watts, what to do to prevent it from happening again. And then in 1966, in the spring, this commission begins to start to redevelop in some way. And so the commission begins sort of how most commissions begin. Here's a commission. We want to understand crime, how crime happens, how we prevent it from happening again. We're going to focus on and then arrange different subsets of the commission and its actors to investigate different areas of this problem. So we've got a task force to focus on organized crime. We've got a task force to focus on the courts and the way that crime, when it happens, are taken up by the judicial system. We have a focus on particular types of crimes like auto theft and so forth. But it's in 1966, early in the spring, that Johnson then starts the task force, or the Science and Technology Task Force, and calls it into being with the explicit remit to tell us how we can use new computing powers that have been useful, successful now in war and space flight and exploration and so forth. How can we translate that computing power in helping us solve and address the problem of crime rampantly on the streets of the United States? Interestingly, when you look at the makeup of that commission, what you find are some leaders in science and technology from primarily academic institutions. And then, of course, you have an oversized footprint by one private company, which is IBM. And interesting beyond that, most of the personnel that made up that contingent of IBM personnel on that task force were people in sales and marketing and not engineering. Though the head of that task force was an engineer, one that we will talk about quickly. How am I doing on time? I know it's got to be getting 10. Okay, I can do that. So we'll skip over talking about Ithiel Desola Poole, who spent most of his career as a political scientist across the way here at MIT, and where we get much of our modern sense about prediction and about predictive modeling, which begins in a computational sense late in the 1950s and early 60s, where Poole is perfectly situated at MIT to have access to two things that he really needs to do computational work in terms of predicting particular behavioral outcomes, namely at the beginning, predicting the US presidential election in 1960. A lot of data, which he had access to through the Roper Center of Public Opinion, also located somewhere around here, Western Massachusetts then. So we had access to large stores of data, or what was considered large stores of data at that time. And he had the computational power needed to process that data in the new computing facilities that he enjoyed at IBM. The person that you see on your right here, Saul, I guess, had many roles working at MIT as a faculty member and researcher, and working much of his career at IBM, heading the engineering teams and as the head of all the federal contracts with IBM that was in his purview for managing for all of IBM. Gass ends up being the head of the Science and Technology Task Force that the president calls into being. And so in thinking about this translation, this was much the part and purpose of Gass's work as an engineer, as an operations researcher. That is, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And then how do we think about that problem computationally? And what are the presumptions or assumptions that we're making every step of the way that gives us then some guidance about the computational solution and how that is designed. And so if you look at this slide closely to what's on the left, you can sort of follow his thinking that begins with some presumptions about policing, right? So the institutionalization part of this comes into to being where we agree, that is the task force, Johnson, et cetera, that the problem of race, the problem of crime is fundamentally something to be taken up by criminal justice institutions, particularly by policing institutions, first and foremost. And so then the problem is translated into a computational form based on a logic about policing. And you can follow that logic here about what deters crime from happening, how do we intervene to actually deter people from committing crime, what do we think about apprehension as a deterrent, what are the technological needs do we need to make all those things happen. But mostly what's important is the image on the right, which is the algorithm that Gass devises in this first instance to help frame and ultimately solve this problem as he's laid out on the left. And I'm going to skip over all the details and use simply the shorthand that what you see in all the computational language on the right is simply what we might term modern computational racial profiling. That's what you see in the math on the right side, right? And so this is the formulation in 1966 about how to use modern computing technology to address and solve this particular problem. That particular solution morphs in several forms and gets pushed into several types of applications. One that I will highlight here that comes online about 1968. It's Alert 2. You can see in the image here, essentially what it is. It's a database for one. So storing all types of criminal justice information, data about suspects, data about their apprehension, if they've been arrested for crimes, data about their time incarcerated, so on and so forth. So it's a database, and it was sold to police officers. Interestingly enough, at the beginning, modern police were like, why the hell do we need all of this? Why do we need computers? Why do we need these sophisticated data systems? We do perfectly good police work without all of this stuff. And so the presentation of the new technology was, it's just going to help us do our work a little bit better, right? Going to help us keep records. We're going to collect the data. We're going to have these stored so we have information there. And that's where that all begins. But then you can see some other elements here. If you look on the right, you see what is a kind of a picture of someone in a backseat of a police car, also looking at a screen with squares, a highlight to the geographical nature of what's coming out of the computation, right? So we're thinking about computation, policing graphically in terms of neighborhood and neighborhood distinctions, mostly broken down in the form of zip codes. which is a key factor if we go back to Gass's algorithm there. And then a final point on the right here, that alert 2 was a network. And so all of these computers and systems were networked both across Kansas City, where it was first debuted, but also connected to other policing systems across neighboring states and with the federal government's National Crime Information Database, the NCIC. So quickly running through this application, there is an evolution of the application, that it is used first and foremost primarily to collect data. Very quickly, there is the progression to collating that data in the form of statistics. And so framing that in terms of an analytical form to try to gain some additional understanding. And you see some of the outputs of that here, and the types of question variables and data that were being critical parts of what this police force wanted to answer. And then from that point, with this data is a short hop to the next and final, if you will, stage, which is the impulse to think about prediction, right? And so all of this happens really across the board in the matter of about a year, right? Like quickly that people see, oh, this is much, 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 much more useful. That not only can we collect and understand something about crime and criminal suspects, we can begin to predict who these people will be, are likely to be, where they will live, and how we most easily then deter them from committing criminal activity. And this is first then put into place. This is about 1971 in the form of what was called Operation Robbery Control. This was simply a way, at first instance, in which Alert 2 was used to predict where most crime of this particular type, which was robbery, which was presenting itself as a particular problem in Kansas City at that moment, was taking place. And so they set up a massive operation, then locating itself in and embedding in the particular locations that the data said this problem presents itself, and then use a variety of police tactics to help then confront and address this. And as you can probably imagine, their area of concentration with the dot there where their command and control team sat was adjacent to the darkest blocks here in this image, those connoting the areas of Kansas City, Missouri with the highest African-American populations at the time, right? One way of looking at this is to say that's unsurprising, right? That ultimately where they would say our data leads us to in terms of being able to commit police resources in order to profile, in order to really focus our attention, is precisely at that place that we had already predefined as the problem that we are facing, right? But it is from there, this mashup, if you will, between this framing of the problem and these steps in the forming and design of this computational solution that produces not only its effect, but then the related infrastructure that begins to be built on top of that. And so we come to scaling. By 1974, there's an Alert 2 of some type in every state of the United States and territories. There are, in some states, multiple. Some states have multiple systems, meaning systems that are used in courts, in criminal justice, in the policing aspect of it, so on and so forth. You can see in some of these tables here, two other interesting elements that are about the infrastructure. One is in this contractor column here, where you see the outside contractors that were used by the federal government to build these systems, or sometimes the state governments to build these systems. IBM is one of those that is found there often. The other is this LEAA grant. The LEAA was the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, an outgrowth of the 1965 Commission, and it was put into place primarily to fund and support different outgrowths of that commission, one of which primarily being these forms of technological applications. And so the funding for all of these new technologies and technological systems then are funded in large part by public funding to build this infrastructure that then over time spurs into various forms of reapplications. We see it rearing its head a lot in the drug war of the 1980s and new types of systems that profile gang activities that are part and parcel of certain communities that are largely Black, and then to this kind of ubiquity where we come back to our present and see instances and examples that are replete across the landscape in terms of the engagement with technological systems that produce various types of discriminatory outcomes that devastate communities of color. So I didn't get to the last part, but we'll do it in the Q&A. And that is, what do we do? Somewhere we have to intervene in these layers of infrastructure, primarily, at least in my mind, at the element of, or at the aspect of problem formation and contextualization, and around the institutions that take up these problems. What do we do? Fundamentally, we've got to ask some different types of questions. And I'll stop there because we're running out of time, but maybe we'll get there during some of the Q&A. Thank you. So, questions. I know we're going to alternate, right, between our audience here.
We will start with questions in the room. And so do we have, I can just, we try to use the mic so people that are online also can hear.
Thank you so much. The question of racial capitalism, I so appreciated how you framed it. And can we look at this separate from that? And the question, you know, and recently we had the evidence that the top 10 billionaires have doubled their wealth since the last 2 years. And they're all mostly, you know, it's tech. Tech is all at the center of it in terms of that wealth. And I think about, in terms of locuses, you know, where to intervene. Where do we have weak links? This higher ed, and here at UMass, Eisenberg, finance, and STEM are what is driving, you know, kind of the tail wagging the dog of everybody being squeezed. And so we're in these institutions and we're training all these young people and then doing this research that is doing this. And so I'm just wondering, in terms of these sites and that larger issue of racial capitalism, can we talk about this separate from that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I don't think that we can talk about it separately. It's fundamentally the same. And so that question about racial capitalism is replete here, where there is not just social utility, right? But there is an economic imperative that's embedded in this landscape that I've laid out here. That is, those who profit and profit heavily. It's no surprise to me, and I think to many others, that where we see these types of technology rear their heads, the fact that they are almost always have the same effect in terms of the communities they impact. But there is always a kind of a doubling down, right? So what I mean by that is thinking about the examples of, you know, a moment, I think, maybe post George Floyd, maybe it happened before that, when, you know, IBM says we're going to get out of the facial recognition business, basically, and halted its development. And Places like Amazon said, no, not us. we're continuing, right? Because it is profitable, and that Amazon in particular, like many of these others, have sort of shown that that sort of profit motive in their seeding of these technologies. They're embedding them in police forces, their partnerships with police forces and in communities to push these types of surveillance technologies out, so on and so forth. So to your real point of your question, no, we can't divorce these two things. And the question is, what do we do at institutions like these, our higher education institutions, to intervene? And I think that is a critical question that has to be rethought from the ground up. I am sure, without even knowing what's the case here at Amherst, is the case at most higher education institutions. And I'm trying to censor myself a little bit before I say something about my own that maybe I don't want recorded. But of course, higher ed and all of these systems are extremely linked, right? Everything that came out in this particular history was in part produced at MIT and other similar institutions, right? Our students, undergraduate, graduate students, who then, the technology transfers, et cetera, into private enterprise, so on and so forth. So I don't think we can disrupt this process without an intervention at that fundamental level, which is for technologists fundamentally who are building these systems for which there will be multiple applications when they get to the marketplace. Fundamentally changing not only the question that they ask in terms of what might these technologies be good and used for, but what is our relationship to the rest of the institutions that will make some use of the technologies that we're building, and instilling some modicum of intentionality around that, right? Which might be a bit naive to think about, right? It's hard to disrupt, and as a provost, no, it's hard to say no to, let's say, a government or to NSF that says, hey, we will give you $100 million of funding to build this thing. Hard to say no to that, right? Hard to say no to the students for whom that money will support them on their educational endeavor. And then ultimately what we end up getting is a doubling down on the system and the applications that perform this work. But nevertheless, I think that's where we have to begin fundamentally our intervention. How to best do that, I'm probably less equipped to say or to venture some ideas, though I have some. But I think that's where this begins. As I had the conversation with some of the graduate students earlier, a kind of fundamental reimagining, right? It's hard to think about how we do business as usual and simply disrupt some part of that in order to make a significant kind of impact. Hope that addresses some part of your.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you just mentioned the facial recognition thing, and I was thinking about facial recognition during your talk, because one response has been, oh, we just haven't programmed the facial recognition right. It's more accurate with some types of faces than others. We just fix that. That's how we're going to make technology anti-racist. And of course, another narrative is this tool is so powerful, and it's entering contexts which we already know are riven with white supremacy and racial discrimination. It's too black box. It scales up too quickly. The smallest thing has such impacts. So the solution of how to make technology anti-racist here is to just not use this.
Right.
To take this technology out of the equation. So I didn't know if that was in your toolbox of solutions. Is that even a thing worth talking about, or is that is the horse out of the barn too late? And maybe you could talk a little bit more about IBM's decision making around that from your understanding, because that's an interesting end to the story about IBM that it's not an end. It's an
Mhm.
interesting turn in the story about IBM that you were sharing.
Yeah, thank you for all of that. I think in one respect, it highlights the tension that is at play here, right? That comes up in different ways. So for me, and for probably, I'm sure many of us, part of this equation is just don't do it. Just don't use it. Just don't build it. But for most of, I dare say, our colleagues in engineering and computer science and so forth, the question presents itself of how do we make it better, right? If the problem is it's biased, that's a term and language that engineers and computer science know about and have solutions for, right? There are computational ways to think about and operationalize and intervene on bias. And so that's where we get, I think a turn starting several years ago with folks like Sophia Noble, who I know was here last year for this talk, or online last year for this talk. Like the question of bias has emerged as a primary analytic and sort of framework, and then the jump to a computational solution, because an engineer sees that as fairly easy and simple. I mean, not easy and simple, but something they understand and therefore can begin to operationalize. And I think that's where the train has left the station in many respects, because companies like an IBM or Google's or Microsoft's or Amazon have taken on that as their way to think about their responsibility or responsiveness to this question of discrimination. We're going to make facial recognition better. We're not going to do it so it excludes people. We're not going to do the biases so it mixes up people in terms of skin tone or the associations with skin tone and people that are in databases as criminals versus those who are not. And I think it highlights the fissures really that go to the heart of this talk, which are, if we understand the fundamental relationship between race and technology historically, we see how much of a folly that course is, right? Because no matter how much we perfect it, its uses are going to be the same. And we can see a multitude of ways in which it will still be abused towards the same outcome, because the logic is still there about why this tool fundamentally exists and why it's fundamentally useful. If we think about all the ways in which facial recognition technology can be used, and then ask ourselves a question, why is it always primarily coming up in the context of criminal justice and criminal justice around people that are the usual suspects? We see then the eventual ends, even if we perfect the technology. And so I think the answer to the how to be anti-racist is much towards the let's not do this. But I do think in many respects that train has left the station, even with your IBMs and so forth saying we are not going to invest more in that development, because there are plenty of corporations that are small and large, in ways that even IBM have connections elsewhere, if not directly to helping to continue to develop those types of systems.
We have a question.
Yes.
From the Zoom that actually dovetails quite nicely with your answer just now. This is from someone named Smith, and his question is, have you spoken? The question from Jeremy Smith is, have you spoken to law enforcement and or technology companies about the problem of perpetuating historic technological bias? And has there been any willingness to address the issue?
Yes to the first part of that question. And the answer to the second part is a little bit more difficult, because some I would label maybe unwillingness, but it's really a lack of understanding of the problem itself, right? And so sometimes when I'm talking to law enforcement about these dimensions, they simply don't have the technology context to think through the types of implications that I'm talking about and trying to engage with. Mostly it's sort of black and white in the same sense in which sometimes engineering folks approach this question, right? There are cameras, we have crime, the camera produces video or images that help us apprehend. Why is that bad in any situation? Why and where would that go wrong? Why would we not want to invest in systems that help us do that? And then to talk about beyond that in terms of further implications, sometimes there's just a critical lack of understanding and bridging in translating what those problems are. To the degree that there is some willingness, I think there's a similar level of what's the word? I think just lack of hope or reality that things will change or can change, largely because of the scale of change needed, right? So to intervene in this particular way is the magnitude of the transformation for, say, NYPD is institutional, right? It's institutional. It means a whole course correction, both in terms of policy, in terms of funding, in terms of the economic decisions, and the overturning of a philosophy that simply says crime exists here and by these people, and to the degree that we can marshal technology to identify both and police and intervene, that is a good thing. All of those things together, all of them individually are hard to overturn. All of them are together are almost insurmountable. And so to the degree that I talk to some law enforcement that are aware of and thinking the same way about these implications, there is that sense, what are you going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do as an individual police officer, so on and so forth.
My question is so you already raised important questions to start with, how the technological infrastructure is being established and embedded in everyday life. So I would like to know really more about who defines the program, who benefits, who funds. But these things are sometimes or very often behind the scenes. And I would like to know how to identify people who decide and make the decisions and where to start, like government report, policy report, and how to access the people, important figures in technological companies or in the government.
Yeah, great question.
Can I add to that? Because I think that your map is very relevant for current discussions on how to regulate algorithms. We have in Congress, actually, in this country, proposals now. There are conversations about that in the FTC, how to apply certain regulation to algorithms, sectors. So I think that, how to make it visible, correct? A lot of the conversation about algorithmic governance and regulation is about the after the fact, correct?
Right.
It's how to apply audits when the damage has been done.
Right.
Correct?
Right.
And how to scrap data from things that remain behind, the scene and are owned by companies.
Right.
But according to your, historical account, and seems that exactly what Dami was saying, like the moment of problem definition, the moment of developing solutions is crucial.
Mm-hmm.
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex question and a good one. And so the first to the sort of how we identify, and to a certain degree, what we need is some of the things that are here or represented in this image, which is a way of connecting the dots, right? So if we were to do a network, let's say, map of some of this data, part of what it would help to reveal is who was involved, what was spent to build these things, what sectors or particular areas of government were involved, what was actually produced, so on and so forth. But then you make the observation, which is correct, that most of the time, this type of observation, and therefore revelation and data, is so far after the fact. And so I guess my question or my answer is, to really intervene means having some type of network and placement across all of these institutions that are embedded in there at the moment that problems present themselves, right? Let's think about COVID, right? It comes up as a problem immediately, like day one. Every engineering school across the country, in the same way that ours was, what do we build to help make this happen, right? We're going to make different types of masks or respirators, et cetera, as time goes beyond. How do we track infections? What can we build in terms of solutions? Very early on, people are sounding the alarm of, hey, we look like we're headed into some trouble. We've seen this before. But what I mean to point out is that's a moment where a particular problem begins to have national and even international importance, and then the rush towards technological solutions. And that is the moment when the problem is beginning to be framed. And the only way, I think, to intervene and disrupt is to already have people who are poised to answer or to address, to raise the right questions at that moment, already placed and in the room, right? As a senior administrator at my institution, I was in a set of meeting committees, et cetera, where we were thinking about questions of, will we use an IBM built tool or another third-party tool to help track people that might get COVID? What do we do about particular areas of our community and people in our community in terms of race, gender? Will we connect these things to some aspect of our HR records, right? Will we want to know someone got COVID and also where they are placed in the university, how much they get paid, how much would be, what's the risk of having that person outside of the workforce, perhaps for a period of time? Do we connect those data in the service of being able to track and intervene on the spread of COVID, right? And it's only at that moment where you're able to have folks to say, we shouldn't do this, we should be thinking about that. No, we shouldn't build that. Here are some interventions. No, those won't work. But that's not, I would dare say, typically the way our institutions are set to work. Number one, the right people are not in those places, and they're not in the places where those institutions have formal and informal relationships to the others, meaning there's not a person at NYU on a team at a level to help make decisions that's also intimately connected to a Google that's building a particular tool in real time to help shape and intervene, as well as someone in a state, local government, health system or agency to say, we can use this in a hospital context. So all that, is a little bit vague, but I think it goes to the question of what we need to do. And number one, or after that, the difficulty of doing that. And that's precisely, I think, the power of infrastructure, right? Is it blinds us to all of those things and makes much of that inaccessible, so that when problems come up, they're redefined or shaped and framed in the same way, typically, and therefore the same outputs, the same implications, the same types of harms that get perpetuated.
We have just time for last question, so.
I got it.
You're it.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for a talk. Man, I
Thank you.
think one of the things that caught me, and I think that's the reason to those exercise, is to extrapolate. We don't know where we go up before we see it, right?
Right.
But one part that caught my eye was the map of Kansas City, what to expect in Kansas City.
Mm-hmm.
But at that moment, it hit me like how we scale those problems on the planet. When we intersect geography or geopolitics, race, ethnicities, in the use of technology. Because some are problem solving, other problem solving. If it's the other over there, it's like how will we manipulate and destroy them?
Mm-hmm.
You see, so there is, at least in my sense, like with the global south, the famines, or a simple example, like how but the war on Ukraine is understood totally different from the war that was happening before in Yemen, the Tigray region. And we see even technology being used in different ways on Europe, but we pretend we don't see. But those same divisions are the same usual suspects, are the same problems.
Right.
They've identified.
Yep.
Like I think it fits well with your last answer of COVID, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Who I'm vaccinated.
Yep.
And who,
Exactly.
how many are not?
Yeah, and it's interesting even going back to this map and Alert 2 when it debuted in 1968. Kansas City Police Department was inundated with law enforcement from Canada, from China, from places in Brazil, all over the world, right? Because the problems were the same. And this was essentially a kind of a model, right? Here in Kansas City, these people are Black American and concentrated in a particular location that we call both politically, socially, and technologically a problem. But this is just a model for your problem in New York City, and your problem in San Antonio, Texas, and your problem in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and your problem on and on and on across the stage, which is why I think, to the degree that it is difficult to think about both the framing of and reshaping of the problem, that is fundamentally the level of intervention. And what persists across this time period is the problem persists, or the problem as articulated persists, right? And so that in many respects has to change. So long as our problems are always framed around people who are Black, who are brown, who are poor, who are immigrants of a certain type, typically immigrants who are Black, brown, and poor, our technological systems will gravitate to these people as targets, right? As the thing to be solved. And so in this first instance, at least my takeaway from it was crime wasn't the problem to be solved, right? Blackness was the problem to be solved. The challenge to racial power was the problem to be solved, for which this technology was the intervention. And so fundamentally, when we think about how to make our technology anti-racist, it is to think differently about who and what our problems are, and the reframing of that. And so one thing that often, gives me some modicum of optimism or hope, where I typically have very little in this particular area, are seeing people who are asking very different types of questions, right? And formulating very different types of problems that are not of the variety that typically have been those that have informed our technological systems. And I'll give a little shout out here to spending the last couple of weeks or so reviewing a lot of proposals for a, what is it, the Just Tech Fellowship, Social Science Research Council, where it's exciting to see researchers of varying types, including engineering teams, as well as teams of anthropologists and sociologists and so forth, talking about technological development and issues that have vastly different framing of the problem, right? I mean, what happens when we frame police as a problem and then think about technological development as it continues and perhaps scales in that way? What might that look like, and what might be the scale of change? What when the problem is fundamentally about lack of access or investment from a whole, from let's say Africa, and from the vantage point of Africa, what does that mean in terms of its position and relationship to the rest of the world? And if that current position is fundamentally problematic and is the problem that we set out to build technological systems to solve, what does that look like? And I think our history is not replete with examples of imagining what that could look like. But I think that's certainly where we must start, which is how do we think about different problems and how do we imagine the types of technological designs and solutions that might come from that? What will they look like? What could they look like? What impact could they have if they were, like these other things, afforded the ability to develop into our infrastructure in ways that these criminal justice-based technological systems have? Is that it? We're done. Thank you. Thank you. Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you so much.